Hey there guys, it's Joey. Welcome back to I Can't Witch Without, and this week we are looking at roses. We're going to look at roses because it is Lupercalia today, which is otherwise known as Valentine's Day in modern terms. So I thought we would look at roses. It's about time we had a look at a flower. And the disclaimer at the start of this video, as always, the I Can't Witch Without series is to look at things that I use regularly within my witchy practice or have particular witchy meaning or that I enjoy working with. It's not to say that you cannot be a witch without any of these items. So as usual, we're going to start with two definitions, one from Scott Cunningham's Encyclopedia of Herbal Magic and the other one from Paul Barrell's Compendium of Herbal Magic, as a jumping off point, and then we're going to talk about this flower. And it's an interesting one, and before we're going to get started, if you say roses to a lot of people, and some witches included, they immediately jump to it has a very singular use. And the more and more I think about it, and the more and more I meditated on it and really researched into it a little bit more and thought about it a little bit more, I was like, I use it for all sorts of things. And as I came to sort of correlate the information and all the things that I wanted to make sure I included on the video, the plan, I realised it's one of those things that for some reason becomes simplified down in terms of its witchy purpose. So we'll get onto that in a bit, but first and foremost, from the Cunningham book, meanings are given as feminine Venus and the element water, sacred to deities Hathor, Huldar, Eros, Cupid, Demeter, Iris, Adonis, Aurora, powers of luck, psychic powers, healing, love divination, and protection. Magical uses. Roses have long been used in love mixtures owing to the flower's association with the emotions. A chaplet of roses worn when performing love spells, removing the thorns, or a single rose vase on the altar are powerful love magic aids. Rose water distilled from the petals is added to love baths. Rose hips, the fruit of the rose, are strung and worn as love-attracting beads. A tea of rose buds drunk before bed induces prophetic dreaming. To discover their romantic future, women used to take 3 green rose leaves and name each for one of their lovers. The one that stayed green the longest answered the question of which one. I wonder why that's supposedly just women. Rose petals and hips are also used in healing spells and mixtures, and a rose water saturated cloth laid on the temples will relieve headache pain. Also added to fast luck mixtures, and when carried act as a personal protectant. Rose petals sprinkled around the house calm personal stress and household upheavals. So I actually use rose water in my peace water. It's one of the rose water uses. So if you're interested in a peace water recipe, that is on the channel already. Try and remember to link it. Okay, and then from the Compendium by Paul Barrell, which as usual has more information. Aphrodisiac herb, funeral herb, herb of consecration, herb of love, magical herb, invocational to Aphrodite, Bacchus, Dionysus, Sappho and Venus. Lore. Sacred to Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. First joined with Hestius, who was decidedly not handsome. She pursued instead the joys of love with Ares, Hermes, Poseidon, Dionysus, and a few mortals. It is sometimes said that the red rose gained its colour from spilled blood after Aphrodite caught her foot on a thorn when with Adonis. In Rome, the rose was associated with Venus, Cupid and Bacchus. To the Romans, according to a modern herbal, the rose was a sign of pleasure, the companion of mirth and wine, but it was also used at their funerals. Sappho, the legendary poet from ancient Greece, called the rose the queen of flowers. From Rodell's illustrated encyclopedia of herbs, we learn that Cleopatra had her floors covered with rose petals in order to seduce Mark Antony, because she believed the rose promoted love and passion. Despite the sensual pleasures associated with the rose, it has been used to represent secrecy. It was suspended from the ceiling at meetings which were held in the strictest of confidences and placed by the confessional in Roman Catholic churches. Usage. Rose represents all aspects of the goddess, the ability to love and nurture and to see beauty in all things. Rose may be used in rituals to honour the goddess or used by a priestess when drawing down the moon. It's associated with emeralds. One is consecrating jewellery set with an emerald or empowering an emerald stone for magical work. It should be dressed with rose oil. The rose is also associated with the Seven of Cups, although we will look into that in a bit, and it's actually associated with some other cards in generalised deck meanings. A flower so popular it has come to be associated with hand fastenings and rituals of union. Some bring roses into all their Sabbath rites, recommending white for autumn equinox, yellow for Ostara, midsummer, and for red, and any colour for Beltane. Okay, so the first point I really want to touch on from that, which I think is really important, is that it represents the goddess in all her aspects. Also not mentioned here, it's considered a flower of the Fae, very much so. And in a lot of spell workings or spell books and things of that nature, it recommends using rose amongst other things as offerings to the Fae. Right, so for me, rose has become associated with love, and it becomes marginalised, very much like the day on which we are looking at this flower in itself, which has become Valentine's Day. It becomes marginalised and to represent the romantic love between two people, and therefore rose comes down this sort of narrowing field of vision in what it can be used for. And it comes to represent love magic in the form of finding your true love spell, and that's what comes to the fore all the time. And if you ever Google, for example, love magic, and you look on images, roses will be in all of them, usually, nearly all of them anyway. And it kind of really presents the idea of love as being such a narrow field of vision. It forgets about divine love, it forgets about love for a fellow human being, it forgets about the love of friends and friendship and family, be it blood family or extended family. It forgets about love for ourselves. And I've actually been talking a little bit about this on Facebook yesterday, and I think I'll just include it here as a little bit of something. I was talking about the very narrow way in which we look at Valentine's Day, and we sort of forget it has a pagan root to the holiday, as most of our holidays do. And people get annoyed with it and say, you know, oh, it's become so commercialised, it's not worth it, you should love your partner all year round, which is true. You should, and you shouldn't wait until a particular day of the year to celebrate love, by all means. But I was talking about it in terms of the fact that all holidays have a commercial edge. It doesn't really bother me to see flowers and hearts and things around. It doesn't bother me whatsoever. It's quite kind of uplifting. And if I was to sort of get on the train where I complained about the commercialisation of Valentine's Day, I would have to complain about the commercialisation of all holidays. And that would mean no Halloween decorations up around the time of the year which I love. And you know, you don't have to engage with commercialism in order to celebrate any particular holiday. You can do something simple, something non-commercial to celebrate love. It doesn't have to be buying into anything materialistic at all. So, with that said, love magic and roses have that same sort of marginalisation. We commercially think of roses as sort of being the go-to flower, particularly for relationships. However, roses seem to have such a deep, deep connection with our psyche and with our history that we should really re-examine how we look at the flower itself. Here in Beryl's book, he discusses the fact that it is associated with the divine feminine in all her forms. For me, when I was interacting with roses in the very beginning, and even now, my immediate reaction to roses is that they are mother goddess energy, out of the stages of maiden, mother and crone. And for me, the rose, particularly the red rose, is very sexual in nature. It's about coming into one's own bloom, which of course the symbology there matches up precisely. So it is very much about the female power, the female energy of one's sort of sexual awakening, one's power over oneself. And interestingly enough, when I really started to think about it, I was thinking about how the blood red roses were very connected in my mind with female blood, and there are menstrual spells connected with red roses in particular. From the Element Encyclopedia of 5,000 spells, we have the red roses menstrual spell. The spell, intended on bringing on a period or to stabilise the menstrual cycle, must be performed when roses are in bloom. Wash all over with rose water, then toss your used bath water over a blooming red rose bush. Obviously that's not a huge amount of detail on the spell in particular, but it is there. And that of course is the correlation of colour. Rose is perhaps the flower with the most amount of varied species and types, as well as probably the one with the most amounts of colour, varied colours. It has a language all of its own. Before we completely get into that side of things, I want to reel back a bit and say that in terms of the colours, that can often change how we view the rose in terms of its god or goddess energy. So if we keep with the goddess theme, if you go back to a sort of pinker rosebud type energy, that's more perhaps associated with the maiden aspect, with spring, with the beginning, with the possibility, that blood, that bud which has yet to come into bloom. Oh, you have to excuse me, I've been a little bit unwell recently. That potential, that beginning, that even like the little red bud cheeks, you know, that beginning to blossom. And then on the crone side, how you view the crone rose energy is interesting. My first initial thoughts were going to the white roses, and a lot of people in modern consciousness, I guess if you like, would associate white with a more pure state. In fact, white used to be the colour of death, and for me that kind of correlates a little bit better, the white crone, that coming into sort of a purity of self, of wisdom, of the preamble to death and rebirth. On the other hand, you could also talk about rose thorns being very much associated with the crone goddess, and for me it's about piercing the veil. So it's about the walking across of the veil, the death into the rebirth element again. As we've touched on rose thorns, it's worth noting here that in most books they don't really discuss rose thorns. And that for me is because it is usually so against the generalised love meaning which you often find for rose petals or rose buds, that they just tend to sort of steer away from rose thorns. Rose thorns tend to be used in a much more less lovey-dovey sense. They are used for defence and attack workings, protection, reversal, or attack. And it's the sharp, piercing energy that they have. In a book that I have started reading my way through and has really been speaking to me lately, and I'm actually going to do a video on that once I have read it and really sat with it a little bit more, so I'm not going to give away too much, but it discusses the idea of the rose as a symbol of enlightenment, and the thorns are the barriers or the stepping stones up until the bloom, which is the enlightenment. Before we go on to talking about the fact that rose has its own language and colours and symbolism deep within our own psyche, I think it's worth noting here that it really started to it's been bothering me in a lot of ways about how we decided that roses are so associated only with feminine energy. Whilst obviously if we sort of draw on roses for menstrual imagery, that is very much feminine only. It's not to say that a masculine energy isn't present within roses. It has become so deeply entrenched within our psyche that it is associated with female energy that perhaps we have gotten away from the fact there should be a balance within all things. I often sort of talk about the fact that I feel that there should be a balance of masculine and feminine energy within each essence, because divinity cannot truly be separated, because it isn't just feminine in my mind, that both energies reside within each archetype as we see it, and therefore masculine energy must come into it somehow. On its most very basic level with roses, you can consider the male acceptance of roses as a form of love token in giving. But perhaps it should go beyond that, because we have become so entrenched in these sort of gender roles that sort of roses and a male sort of enjoying roses or purchasing roses for himself has become this sort of odd thing to do, and it's one of those weird gender sort of stereotypes that has come across in the evolution of society, I guess. And there's something sad about that, really, because why should a man not promote self-love for himself just as much as a woman should? Why should he not bathe in rose petals if he so wishes it? And yet a lot of people would sort of turn their nose at that idea. So moving on from that, as that's just a sort of side note of my thought, I guess, rose has its own language, and it's really fascinating to me how rose as a flower by itself has more meaning attached to its colours, different colours across, its numbers, its numerology, as well as its symbolism. So some colour meanings from, just taken briefly from the internet for roses. Red is associated with love, beauty, courage and passion, dark red being unconscious beauty, white being associated with a symbol of purity, innocence and humility, pink being admiration, appreciation and gratitude, and yellow being friendship, new beginnings and joy. If we really stop and think about it here is a method in which we can really start to evaluate how we as witches interact with roses on a magical level. I've talked in the past and recently about the fact that I really enjoyed the introduction of, into popular consciousness at least, of colour magic in forms of banishing, and there's a list of colours and how they can be utilised to use to reverse and banish things which are harmful to you in terms of colour magic. And pink and red were actually used to do with reversing things that were being heavy on your heart, whether it to be personal depression, whether it be attacks of a heart-based nature, attacks on your heart chakra, attacks on your relationship, things of that accord. So it still has that familiar vein, but it's talking about protection and reversal. And here, rose has all these different colours and all these different meanings. So how we interact with the different rose petals, the different rose buds, and even different parts of the rose itself can be completely different. We talked about the fact that thorns have a completely different meaning in witch consciousness because of the shape, because they are sharp, because they're not as pretty and soft as the petal. For me, there is an element of sort of spiritual awakening attached to roses, because they can make us look at how we interact with magical items, magical herbs, magical flowers, and so forth, and really take a good hard look at how we are interacting with particular elements. Are we being too superficial with how we look at it? Are we not investigating? Are we not exploring? Are we not seeking in-depth meaning enough attached to the power and amazing magic of flowers, plants, and the earth in general? Do we put a sort of, oh, I know what that means love magic, and forget that we really need to explore beyond that level? Do we need to explore the deeper meanings, the deeper colours, the deeper numerology to a deeper level to promote better understanding and become better versions of ourselves? So, alongside colours, the numbers of roses also have their own meaning. A single rose is said to be the utmost devotion in terms of gift giving. 2 roses is a combination, a union, perhaps marriage. 6 is the need to be loved or cherished. 11 assures the recipient they are truly and deeply loved. And 13 is indicative of a secret admirer. The numerology goes beyond that to symbolism within artwork, within rose artwork. In the art of the Renaissance, a rose with 8 petals was symbolic of renewal and rebirth. In alchemy, in texts of alchemy and art, a rose with 7 petals is a symbol of inclusion, universal understanding, and order. In the standardized tarot, is a symbol of balance, appearing in the Magician, Strength, Death, and Fool cards. It's worth noting here as well that what I think rose is truly about is about union, and that has sort of come to mean love. If you think of it in terms of history, which I love to do, the symbol of the Tudor house is a white and red rose, which was the linking of the Lancaster and York houses. And that ended war and civil unrest, so it came to mean union in terms of marriage, but it also came to mean a union of a people, a unification of a people, and to this day the Tudors are probably one of the most famous houses of history in terms of English royals, for a number of reasons, but that is again associated with the rose. It's a really strong symbol in terms of popular consciousness, one that we have carried since ancient Egyptians, since, Cleopatra's sprinkling it on her floor for love to woo Mark Antony, and we still think of it in those terms today. But it also, for me, it really does talk about something beyond. It talks about union, And this can be the union of the goddess in all of her energies. It can be the union of masculine and feminine energies within divinity. It can be commonplace union, as in the union between people, but it doesn't have to necessarily be a romantic or sexual union. It can go beyond that. It can be a friendship union. It can be all sorts. It can be a spiritual union. It can be the union of a person seeking spiritual enlightenment in terms of the book that I've been looking at. The union of oneself in terms of an earth body and a spiritual body, with the stem and the thorns being about the overcoming of the trials of the earth body, and the blooming rose being of a symbol of beauty and spirituality and spiritual enlightenment. It can be a union of the past and the present because it has such deep, deep meanings for us today, and it always has seemed to have had deep, deep meanings, and has been on our minds as a human beings, as a consciousness, as a thought, as a hitting somewhere deep within our emotions and in our psyche throughout history. It's the union of symbolism with the mundane, of the imagery becoming important and taking on more meaning to us and helping us in the path down spiritual enlightenment. I think I probably could go on about all sorts of different kinds of union, about how Rose sort of unites so much over time, space, thought and emotion. And I think it really is one of those flowers that deserves more consideration, more investigation. It appears in our tarot, it appears in our popular consciousness, it appears every day in some way or another. One of the very earliest protection spells of a meditation form that I ever learnt was of the rose protection, and it was about drawing rose vines up yourself and having the thorns pointed out for protection, and the flowers would blossom and bloom and absorb any negative energy and then sort of crumble and fade, but they would re-blossom again afterwards until the point where you are so safe and surrounded by universal love. So for me, rose represents the very beginning of my path, even up to now. So it sort of represents the union of a witch in flux, and a witch in learning, and a witch in her path-seeking journey. So that's going to be it for this video for today. Many blessings.